Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in breakout session A, Big Impact Small Scale, Advancing Housing Equity Through Small Scale Projects. Let me go ahead and introduce myself and my amazing and awesome co-panelists. My name is Asen NDI or Abubakar NDI. I'm the Partnership for the Base Future Fellow in San Jose. And I'm working on a couple of different things, and I'll talk about it a little bit more as this conversation continues. But first, let me go ahead and throw it to my amazing co-panelists. First, Caroline Fang, who's the Community Real Estate Director for the Mission Economic Development Agency. Caroline, do you want to say a few words?
Morning, everybody. Good to be joining you to talk about what we're doing with our preservation efforts in San Francisco.
And Aubrey Levine, who's the Real Estate and Development Director for the Unity Council.
Hi, Aubrey here. I'm really excited to be joining you guys to talk about preservation work.
Great, amazing. And so just really quickly, I'm just going to talk really quickly about sort of the work that I've been working on in San Jose and how this dovetails really into this strategy around small site acquisition. As part of the Partnership for the Base Future Challenge Grant, we'll be working on developing a community opportunity to purchase program. And part of that program would include figuring out ways to build up a preservation infrastructure that includes figuring out what the financing and the development pipeline and the community partners would look like to be able to preserve over the long term the already existing affordable housing stock. And part of that work really is focusing on small site acquisition. I think that's what we've heard from our long-term community engagement process. So in reality, I feel very grateful and very glad that the partnership chose me to help moderate this panel, because I feel like I'll be able to learn, just as you will, a lot that will help me locally help to build up a small site acquisition program in San Jose. All right, so without further ado, to just kick things off, I wanted to see, what do you two think are the three most important things that lead to the successful completion of a small site program or project in Oakland and San Francisco?
Yeah, I think that these probably apply universally, but do your due diligence. I mean, that's so critical. And I think especially in these preservation projects where you're often dealing with older buildings with a lot of deferred maintenance, to know as much as you can about the state of the physical state of the property. And as well as, talking to the residents. I know that some jurisdictions have requirements around those, and sometimes it's difficult to coordinate that with the seller, but if you can, definitely engage the residents. And also finally, knowing your financing partners, developing those relationships, knowing what type of opportunities are out there that are specific to this type of work, and that you could potentially use to be a little bit more creative and thinking outside the box. So just understanding the technical nuances of that as much as possible.
Yeah, echoing what Abra is saying, and then adding to that on the tenant side. I mean, we're in political times, we're in emotional times where really it's important to be thinking about who are we actually serving, and having our tenants be at the center of this is critical. This is the difference between preservation and production. For production, we don't know who's going to come into the building, partly because of fair housing, and we have a lot of efforts around that. But preservation, you've got families and seniors who are living in these buildings. So knowing who they are, having them be your best allies to both becoming owners of the building and then staying sustainable owners, and also building towards future political and financial sustainability of buying more buildings is critical. Definitely that's what we've seen in San Francisco. And to that. And if it weren't for the tenants, we probably would not have had the funding. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but the funding towards making this happen. So that's the second thing, is having the funding to make the difference between what the market thinks that the building is going to go for and what we would need to be able to keep our low income, low rent paying tenants in the buildings. And then the last I would say is organizational readiness. I think lessons learned, Meta has certainly learned a lot in our 6 years. And as we continue to grow and learn, we know that transforming organizations so that they are ready for what it takes to become preservation owners is critical too. So it would be the three things I would say.
Yeah, and just hearing from what you both just said, it sounds like really having that community engagement and involvement from the existing residents and also the neighboring community really matters. Just from personal experience, it seems like production has a huge constituency and folks are pushing for it. Protection also has a constituency, but preservation really is the thing that really needs to build up a constituency for it. And part of that is really kind of figuring out what the financing will look like. Can you folks talk a little bit more, and I think we have some slides on this, about what the perspective is based on like availability of funding in your jurisdictions?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it's like to do preservation work in a city with limited or little public subsidy. And I would also add maybe inconsistent public subsidy. I think those are all challenges that we face doing the work we do primarily in Oakland at this point. And I wanted to start with the challenges. We'll talk about solutions in a second, but I think one of the challenges is that limited subsidy often translates into limited rehab scope. Just because you're trying to, you have to minimize your total costs in order to make the project financially feasible a lot of times. And that's unfortunate because it sets up the property for higher replacement costs during operations and potentially more problems levied on the property management team. And so there's always this delicate balance between kind of the operating side and the capital side, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more later, but that comes up. And then I think just because families have been living without services support doesn't mean that they don't need those services or wouldn't benefit from them. And so I know a lot of our efforts have been around finding creative ways to fund services for families, because often the properties themselves that can't support the cost of doing so. And in our experience, sellers are not anxious for potential buyers to interact with tenants in advance of escrow close. So our contact with tenants is unfortunately often very limited prior to acquiring the building. There's also another challenge is uncertainty about whether funds are available and in what time frame. It makes getting into contract all the more risky and potentially much more costly. And so we have to be very strategic about what properties we're going after and ensure that the time frame will allow for the funding process to unfold. And then in Alameda County, properties that don't have regulatory agreement with public agencies have to meet a 90% threshold for affordability in order to get a welfare tax exemption, which is often critical for our to balance the operating budget. And so when the public agencies don't have resources, one way that they might consider assisting in this type of work is to come up with a way to provide a regulatory agreement to the nonprofit developer in order to enable that welfare tax exemption.
And for those of us who are like just getting our heads together around this and are just trying to figure out exactly how to build up a new program like this, Carolyn, can you talk a little bit about sort of what the financing stack looks like from the perspective of a city that's like sort of investing in these kinds of programs? And I think we want to go to the next slide as well.
Sorry, I was waiting for the slides to change, and I can share it briefly. So as Aubrey was sharing, there are a lot of challenges, and certainly what we've been able to do throughout our different cities, and just really quickly on this, is preservation is actually relatively comparable to production for those who are familiar with the cost of production. And so with the subsidy, if you get a subsidy from our local agencies, you can bring in as much as 40%. Without that subsidy, really what you're challenged by is trying to make up that difference. And so you can see the huge difference between when you have that yellow bar. And then if you look at new construction, of course, it's still a smaller yellow bar than what you might have in new construction. So just giving you a relative sense of what we look at when we're trying to talk about, hey, how do we actually make this work if we did have some local funding. So if you go to the next slide, and I actually think that Abra was going to speak to this, but I can certainly speak to this. If you could switch to the next slide. On some, I'll just speak to the impact real quickly. So what we've been able to do in San Francisco is jumpstart what, frankly, prior to 2014, we had none of these buildings in place. And so really focusing on the green really speaks to, we've been able to buy over 32 buildings representing about 200 plus households in 5 years from very little infrastructure. Whereas if you compare to the production infrastructure, there's a lot more in the rest of the Bay Area to really support this. We didn't have contractors, we didn't have local staff who really fully understood what preservation for buildings that were 4 to 25 units would look like. And so that willingness to engage with those smaller buildings and with the tenants and really get under the hood of what does it take to rehab was something that we kind of created from zero in San Francisco. What we were successful in doing is having local and ready capital from our adding San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund, and then having San Francisco through various bond measures, as well as putting money aside from our inclusionary housing, be able to provide long-term capital. And then organizations like Meta, Aubrey spoke to this earlier. I mean, going out on a limb as an organization like a Meta or a Unity Council takes a lot. And when you're thinking about the organizational balance sheet, it's a significant deal for us to be able to take it on. And we wouldn't have done it if we weren't responding to our families and our community at the forefront, saying, we are staying in San Francisco, we are staying in Oakland, we are staying in our neighborhoods, we're staying in our city, and how can we find alternatives to make this happen and work with the community organizers to make it happen. So if we go to the next slide. So then speaking to how we actually made it happen. So in San Francisco, we are putting in about $483,000 to purchase a unit. And, you know, that speaks to the high cost of San Francisco. And from that, we're able to keep most of the money actually towards both the purchase as well as towards the rehab. It's significant to make sure that we're setting aside money towards rehab, because of the cost of buying these buildings isn't just the physical cost, it's also they often have deferred maintenance. And that was what Aubrey was speaking to in terms of the deferred maintenance. Before I go to the financing stack, can we maybe go back up 3 slides and have Aubrey speak a little bit to what we do in order to make sure that we're doing the right due diligence for buying the buildings?
I think it's the slide right after this, the solutions.
There you
go. Thanks, Caroline. So one of the things that we want to do in terms of getting into the building is make sure that you're doing a really thorough inspection of every unit. Again, if you can, you know, often the tenants we found are the best most knowledgeable about what's happening in the building. A lot of times they've lodged complaints that haven't been addressed, sometimes for years. And so they can tell you exactly what's going on and what hasn't been fixed. But it's really important to do as much kind of physical inspection as possible, in addition to looking at a phase 1 and structural and all the other kind of third-party reports that you would typically get. We've been setting up, I spoke to services, and one of the things that we've been doing is setting up a reserve just for the first couple of years. It's important to note that, even if you do have contact with the tenants before purchasing the property, there's definitely a transition going from, maybe a rent controlled building or a building that has had no rent control or any sort of income certification process. It's a change. And so, just helping management to move that process along to the lease signing, the income certification, that's a pretty heavy lift to walk into a community that hasn't experienced that before and help them to understand why it's ultimately in their benefit and then to, make that all work. So I think one of the things that Caroline spoke to earlier was organizational readiness. And I think that kind of falls under this category to make sure that, your services and property management teams are up to that challenge. And I talked a little bit earlier about kind of in-house underwriting for the private sources. I think that's probably, it's critically important in places where there's not as much city subsidy, but great all around. And then we've in many cases had to defer a pretty significant portion or all of our fee in order to make a project work. And that is not sustainable to do for every property, but as Caroline said, we're doing this primarily for the mission. And so, if that's the way we have to continue doing it to make it work, then we'll figure it out. But the subsidy is helpful in terms of supporting the organizations doing the work as well.
Yeah, no, and I think that really speaks to sort of the need to figure out how to sustain like the actual organizations doing this work. Like to that end, sort of like, what do you think are the best ways to help sort of build up, to do capacity building, to help build up the capacity of organizations to be able to do preservation in the Bay?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that making sure you have, we've spent a lot of the last year actually kind of developing a network of contractors and consultants that are familiar with working at this scale, because it is actually a really different contractor base from our new construction projects. And so and it's great because a lot of the consultants and contractors that we're using for our preservation work are smaller, they're local, and so we can invest and support our local economy more than I think the new construction projects tend to have a wider draw of contractors. I think that we talked about a little bit making sure that your property management, your services, if you have those folks in-house, are that you're communicating regularly about the challenges and the timeline. Your accounting staff is also another one. So just making sure that there's good inter-department communication within the organization and some kind of procedures established to figure out how you're going to tackle the various problems and things like you might acquire a building where a property manager, an on-site property manager has lived for 20 years. Do you bring that person over or do you install your own staff there? Things that you might not think about right away, but I think there's a lot of learn as you go. And then just the technical understanding of and relationship development with the debt and equity products that are available. And again, I think knowing those on a more technical level is perhaps a little more critical when there's not a city subsidy, but has been really important for our work.
Great.
Yeah.
Sort of, what do you think?
Yeah. Can we jump to the last slide, slide 10? These are some of the things that we've been thinking about in terms of capacity building, everything that Abra was saying internally, as well as, I think that part of the value of a conference like this is being able to have more peer networks and finding the financing for peer networks. We've been able to pivot into housing preservation ourselves through a lot of learning by doing. And we've been rapidly sharing that model as quickly as we've been learning. And so over the last year, San Francisco has funded us since the beginning of COVID-19. So it was around June to be working with other San Francisco organizations to support them in their growth. And so figuring out ways to help other peer networks so that we're all not learning by doing, as Abra was saying, and finding our own contractors and finding our own property management company, but doing the, more of that, and actually just straight funding for the organizations that are ready to start doing this work. This is not easy work, and there's a lot to the different parts of the organization to do that. There's also looking at reinforcing the tenant movement and finding other ways to reinforce the tenant movement. And then I would say the last, and this sort of speaks to capacity building, but also speaks generally to just having enough protections for taking what our families in place and what we're doing right now already around SB 91 and rent relief, and figuring out, is there any way to do more quasi-preservation and acquisition preservation so we're being even more innovative rather than just focusing on what debt we currently have. I'm also going to move us to slide 8 and just speak about, in terms of capacity building, we can't do this work, as Abra was saying, without having funding. And so the financial stack is really important. Two things that are alternatives. One is how San Francisco is doing it, which is taking a pilot to expansion approach and initially starting off with 2009 legislation in the last Great Recession, and then putting aside money through inclusionary housing, and then just piloting with $3 million in 2014, adding the Housing Accelerator Fund in 2017, and then continually finding other forms of funding, because as Abra was saying, if there's no sustainable funding, it makes it very hard for us to keep the pipeline going of having preservation acquisition funds. On the other hand, if you don't have a financing stack because your city cannot fund that huge capital stack that we were just showing earlier, there are also opportunities for a rental subsidy as an ongoing source instead. If that rental subsidy exists, then we can leverage additional debt or equity. And so that is another alternative to capital. It means a much lower annual cost than the capital cost, since capital, at least in San Francisco, for instance, is up to $350,000 per unit. And if you're talking about 100 units, that becomes 35 million. And so just adding that up can become really quick in costs. And so alternatively, looking at annual subsidies that offer local operating subsidy, looking at either of those alternatives could further build capacity, because we could make sure that we actually have an ongoing pipeline of funding that we can rely on as we look at buying buildings and preserving them.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. And then since we have about 5 minutes left, for the last question, you both work in extremely sort of racially diverse cities. And I know obviously, like, both organizationally and the fact that you work in highly impacted areas, I'd love to hear how you folks are thinking through an equity strategy and a racial justice strategy as part of your small site acquisition programs.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, Meta started this because of our direct response to the displacement of low-income Latino families in the Mission District, and we knew that because of hypergentrification, that we had lost over 25% of our families that were Latino, and so and now with COVID-19, it's kind of at this double layer of if we hadn't even started those solutions in 2014, we would be even further behind because of the impact of COVID-19 specifically on Latinos. We are the highest impacted residential population because so many Latinos are engaged in essential work from COVID-19. And so these solutions are really important to make sure that as families are impacted by being in overcrowded situations, that we have the opportunity to buy their buildings and create better quality housing for them and keep them in place, because the social networks are really what ensure that they can actually continue to grow community and build community. And so we've found that the preservation work has so many impacts on the Mission District as a neighborhood, and then frankly on the Latino population. I will also say that from a racial equity lens beyond that, it's also making sure that we are building organizations that are based in the neighborhood, ideally led by people of color, and that are staffed by people of color. So in doing this work, we kind of gave ourselves a double bottom line of not just focusing on the housing, focusing on the people who need to get the housing, but also on the people who are building that housing and preserving that housing, and making sure that those people really have the lived experiences that are similar to our families.
Amber?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think we're working with a lot of similar populations and, folks who have been disenfranchised or disempowered, and also a lot of undocumented folks who are skeptical or mistrusting of any sort of authority and just kind of want to stay out of the limelight. And that has, I think, translated to, we're finding that as we gain trust through our property management and services interventions, that tenants are starting to open up about, maintenance issues that they've been kind of dealing with for years that could lead to like serious health problems, and just haven't told anyone. And so because we're able to extend that or create that trust, we're able to let them know through our work that their complaints can be answered, that their health and safety matters, that their community's well-being matters on so many different levels. And so I think that that's a really important aspect of this work.
Just one more plug about just sharing with our peers. We've been approached so many times about like, hey, can you do this in San Jose? Can you do this in other parts of the Bay Area? Can you do this in other parts of the country, right? And right now we're talking to a group in Half Moon Bay that is challenged by this same problem for farm workers, right? And healthcare workers, right? And so I think part of this is that if we're looking at this from a racial equity lens, we've got to figure out how to scale this model by building the capacity and supporting the groups that are ready to start building their capacity, rather than looking to the same old. The housing developers, and Abra and I talked about this in the prep for this, the housing developers that have currently been building affordable housing are not interested in this work. They're not interested in making sure that they get under the hood for the communities that they serve, because it doesn't bring in the big bucks. And so the reality is that there are a lot of other groups that may be interested in this, or housing groups that might be interested in pivoting, but it takes a lot to pivot. And so just really making a plug for how do we capacity build on a network level. Both Unity Council and now Meta are part of NeighborWorks. There are other groups that also fund capacity building. And so leveraging what technical capacity and financial capacity we have in the Bay Area.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you so much, Abra, for your contribution. I know that I'm getting a lot of questions in the chat. Just so you know, we'll be logging all of these questions and be following up with answers. I'm just going to go ahead and commit Caroline and Abra to helping to answer some of these questions afterwards. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate everyone who's participating, for joining us and for listening to this conversation. I really believe that it's hopefully going to be a region-wide movement to really start focusing on preservation policies here in the Bay.